Hi everyone! Today I'm going to walk you through how I transformed this men's dress shirt into this super cute fluffy sleeve crop top. Let's get started! To start, I placed these guidelines on my dress form. These lines indicate where the seams will be on the bodice. I kept it pretty simple and was just using the same seams as the ones on the mannequin. I wanted the end result to look simple and elegant, but with great craftsmanship. I used this thin black tape because I can easily see it through my draping fabric, but you can also use any tape you want. Now that it's done, I draped the muslin on top to start creating the pattern. Up to this point, I have watched a lot of YouTube tutorials and fooled myself into thinking draping is so easy, but boy was I wrong. I had a tough time getting it nice and smooth without stretching the muslin too much. Once I struggled through this process and had drafted all the pattern pieces, I took the muslin over to my table and laid everything out flat. Here I made adjustments to the bust area because I am not as well endowed as my mannequin. I used a curved ruler to go over all the lines and tune them up to make them all nice and neat. Once that is done, I added a 1/2 inch seam allowance all around using this transparent ruler and following all the way around, making marks along the way. Once that is done, I cut out the pattern pieces. I didn't film this part, but I put all the pieces together and tried it on to see if the pattern fits and made a few adjustments to make sure all the pieces line up nice and neat. Next, I did an unnecessary thing where I cut off all the seam allowances on the muslin and then traced the pattern pieces onto paper without any seam allowances. My reasoning for this is that I'm a little neurotic when it comes to being perfect, and I think, keyword here is think, that if I trace out the pattern onto the final fabric and then add the seam allowance in, I would have lines that I can follow along when I sew. Because sometimes the fabric shifts because of the material and it becomes a nightmare to work with. For this fabric, it actually frayed a lot, so the line helped tremendously when I was putting the bodice together. Now it was time to dissect the shirt. The goal was to get as much fabric out of it as I could, so I cut as close to the seams as possible. I actually tried to seam rip them at first to get a tiny extra material just in case I needed. You know about the 20-80 rule, where it's basically saying you want to be as efficient as possible so that you only do 20% of the work but get 80% done? Well, I did the opposite of that for most of this project. Seam ripping was doing a lot of work for not a lot of result, but thankfully, because the shirt was glued to the seams, I was forced to be efficient and cut up the seams. Woo! Once that is done, I ironed out all my fabric nice and flat. Next, I placed my pattern pieces out on my fabric and arranged them so that I can get 2 sets for the bodice, one for the outer facing and one for the lining. I ended up using a little of the top of the shirt and the sleeves of the bodice, all while avoiding these armpit stains that came with the shirt. But it was only $2.50, so yeah. Once I added in the 1/2 inch seam allowance, I cut out all the pieces. The next few steps are pretty unexciting, but I pin all the vertical seams together, making sure that the lines I drawn are matched, and sew them together. Let's take a moment here to appreciate the almost perfect stitching. Ooh. Yeah. Okay, moving on. Next, I press all the seams nice and flat, and then for the lining, I added boning. This is probably a good time to talk about my original idea for this thrift flip. I wanted to create an off-shoulder top at first. But once I finished the bodice and slaved away on making the sleeves, I tried it on and 1, they weren't as cute as how I imagined them to be. 2, I couldn't lift my arms up because the armhole was too low and there's no way for me to make it not as low. So I had to pivot. Anyways, back to where I was. I added in boning to help keep the bodice up for an off-shoulder top, but the end result had straps, so I didn't need to actually spend the extra hour putting in the boning, but that's okay, I learned a new technique. For the outer facing fabric, I added top stitching about 1/4 inch away from the seam to give it that oomph. Once that is done, I sew the lining to the outer facing fabric, press it, trim the excess seam allowance, and understitch the lining. Next, I added the zipper. You'd think that out of my pile of zippers, I have a light pink one. But nope, I didn't, so I used a white one. But that's okay, right? Invisible zippers should be invisible. Anyways, I'm not going through how I added the zipper because it was a whole lot of headache that I don't want to relive. but there are plenty of videos out there that can do a better job than me explaining how to do it anyways. With that said, I don't recommend adding the zipper because even with it, I had some difficulties getting the top to slide over my shoulders. So if you are going to make this, use buttons instead, much easier. Once that is done, I press the bottom seam allowances, pin them down, and then hand sew with an invisible stitch to finish up the bodice. Now, skipping over the part where I struggled to make the original puff sleeves work and stubbornly kept at it for much longer than I should have. Here, I was just ripping up all the stitchings I did for the original sleeves, created 4 rectangles that are 16 inches wide and 7 inches high. I searched all the edges to prevent them from fraying and then joined 2 together to make one biggish loop. Then I finished the top and bottom edges with one open so I would be able to thread a 3/8 inch elastic through. Once the 2 sleeves are done, I attached them to the bodice by matching the side seam of the bodice to the seam of the sleeve and sew the 2 together. And here is the result. Even though the shirt is not how I imagined it to be, I still love it the same. I learned new sewing techniques in every project, and for this one, it was adding in boning and an invisible zipper, both of which were not necessary. But I'm proud of myself for facing my fear of inserting an invisible zipper and not screwing it up too badly. I hope you enjoyed the video. Until next time, bye!